Glasgow Wants to Know with your host, Mr. Uhel Barrickman.
Welcome. Tonight we're going to discuss the origin and customs of two religious holidays, one Jewish and one Christian. To do this, we have as our guest Van Roberts, who is the pastor of the Broadway Church of Christ, and Berky Sloan, who is the owner and operator of a business establishment here in Glasgow. Berky, of course, will be discussing the Jewish holiday, and Van will be discussing the Christian holiday. And we'll start with you, Berky. What is the holiday that we're going to talk about here?
The Hanukkah.
And when did it begin recently, and just when did it end?
Well, it started back in 165 BCE.
What's it celebrate?
It celebrates the destruction of the temple, and the Maccabees, who were Jewish fighters at that time, recaptured the temple. And when they recaptured the temple, they found there was only one vial of purified oil to use in the temple. So they used the one vial, and through a miracle of God, that one vial that was supposed to last for 1 day lasted for 8 days. So we now celebrate 8 days of Hanukkah.
Now, we'll get back to that shortly, but we have some objects in front of you. Please explain what they are.
Okay.
Not necessarily what they're used for right now, just what they are for the time being.
This is a yarmulke, which if you're going to say the blessings to the candles you put on your head should always be covered. This is a menorah, right here, and this is what's called the shamus, which is the head candle, and each night you light the first night 1 candle, second night 2, and so forth on down till you get to 8 days. And this has been used for generations and generations.
And what's it called?
Menorah. This one here happened to come from Israel through a relative of mine that sent it to us. It has been used for thousands of years. It's not changed much at all. Not this particular one, but the menorah itself has been used for thousands of years. And it's come down through the ages, and actually we still probably perform it just like they did back then.
And by we, do you mean all branches of the Jewish religion today?
Yes.
Let's go to you for a while, Van.
Okay.
Of course, we are celebrating Christmas. When and how did it originate?
Okay. Of course, it all goes back basically to the story that you have in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke about the birth of Christ. And it's interesting that we have 4 Gospels, but only 2 of them make any mention of that. Now, as far as the observance of it as a religious holiday, we know that in the 4th century, we have the first explicit reference to a celebration of the birth of Christ among Christian people. And of course, like you usually have when you have a historical reference, most people assume it goes back somewhat before that, but the truth is we really don't know exactly when they began to do this. And it's basically continued to be a part of the Christian faith from that point on, and all kinds of different things have gone on in history, and I'm sure we'll have time to talk about some of those as we proceed along. But that's basically where it comes from. The first explicit mention, though, that we know of this is in about 345. So it's basically in the 4th century, a couple hundred years after the story that we have in the Gospel and the events that we have recorded in the New Testament.
Either through biblical records or historical records, do we actually know the date of Christ's birth?
No. In fact, what we do know would suggest that he was not born in December. for a couple of reasons. Number one, in the winter months in Palestine, shepherds don't stay out in the fields. And secondly, we have some ideas about how they came up with this date, and those, because we know what those are, that's a pretty good explanation that this is not really something, it certainly isn't anything that's ever mentioned in Matthew or in Luke. There is no clue given there about what time of year it was. That kind of comes later, and it comes really more out of Christian tradition than it does out of anything that's explicitly in the biblical text.
It's a little odd that our calendar is supposed to be based on the birth of Christ, but actually he was 4 years old when he was born, or approximately
Right.
4 years old when he was born, according to the calendar.
Yeah, the calendar was actually made up during the Middle Ages, and they didn't have access to some of the records that we have today. And Herod died in 4 BC, so it's pretty clear that Jesus was born sometime before that, and most people would say probably a year or two before that, so probably back to as early as 6 or 7 BC is when Jesus was actually born the way we reckon on our calendar, and that's what you're saying there is correct.
In regard to when there is a record of the first celebration of Christmas insofar as being the birthday of Christ, or celebrating the birthday of Christ, did it occur before or after the Roman Empire had accepted Christianity?
That would be before, because that was, what, 369, I think, was Constantine's Edict of Toleration, and the date that I found was like 345, so it'd be maybe even a little earlier than that. So yeah, that reference would be before that, yes.
But about the same time?
Yes, about the same time.
And I think that much of the tradition originally, of course, the Christian tradition as we know it now was superimposed, but much of the tradition, even in the beginning, was a continuation of a Roman holiday. Is that not true?
Well, there's basically two theories about how they came up with the December date. The first one is the one that you mentioned, and that was that there was a well-entrenched celebration at this particular time, and Christians wanted to kind of take advantage of it or kind of be part of it, and so they chose this as a just sort of a convenient time to do this. The other theory that some people argue is that we do know when Jesus was crucified, and they take the statement that's found in Luke, the 3rd chapter, in verse 23, that says Jesus was about 30 years old at the beginning of his ministry, and they basically just count backwards, and that's the way they're able to come up with a December date. And so that's the other theory, is that it was done in that way. But there's even some others, but those are the two most popular ones. And the one that usually people argue is the one you're mentioning, that there was this winter celebration that was a part of many of the cultures around then, and so Christians just sort of took it over because a lot of the significance that this already present celebration had sort of coincided with what the Christians wanted to remember about the birth of Christ.
Now, Berky, how is Hanukkah celebrated, and just exactly, you've already said the basis of it, how it started and so forth, celebrating the recapture of the temple by the Maccabees after it had been captured, I believe, by the Syrians.
Syrians and the Greeks.
And they recaptured it, and you've mentioned the oil. How do you celebrate the event today?
Well, the event today is an 8-day event. You start out with your menorah. You put in one candle as the start of the first day, and you put in your shamus, which is the head candle, and then you have blessings that you say for each day. And each day you light those, you say the blessings. There's also, during that time, a game called dreidel. This is a dreidel. This one is made in Israel. comes from Jerusalem. And this doesn't have all the signs on it, but it does have signs on it that the kids play a game with, which on here you can see them at the top. A nun, which the kids play with this, means everyone puts something in the pot. If you get a shin, only the person that spins the top puts it in. You get a hay, that means that you get to take half. If you get a gimel, you get it all. Now those are letters of the Hebrew alphabet. They also have traditional foods that they fix during this time of the year, like potato pancakes and applesauce and things like that. This has been done for a number of years. It hasn't changed at all. It's not a real large holiday. It's more of a fun type holiday, where most of the Jewish religious holidays are not. This is one that is. But
Are gifts exchanged?
yes, the way we do it at our family's house is every night we have it, you get a gift. When we get through lighting the candles and saying the blessings, everyone gets a gift. And usually we start out with small ones, and it gets bigger till the last day. Actually, a lot of times, and this holiday generally lands in November or December, or in the Jewish month of Kislev. Sometimes it lands exactly the same time as Christmas. Sometimes it lands in late November, sometimes in December. It's never the same every year.
I believe this year it ended yesterday.
That's correct. Last night was the last night. We lit all 8 candles the last night, along with the head candle.
Now that brings me to a question I was going to ask you. Once you light a candle, does it stay lit for the whole 8 days until you get them all, or do you put them out at the end of each day?
No, they burn till they go out on their own.
Oh, they burn in other words, if the first one that you light doesn't go out within 24 hours, it continues on to the next day, but you put in another candle. Is that?
Well, no, they don't last that long.
They don't last that long, all right?
It lasts about an hour.
About an hour.
About an hour. And you always light this one first, and you light the rest of them with this one, which is the shaman. And in the older days, they may have had some that lasted that long because they used purified oil, where now we use, the candles. But,
Well, excuse me,
okay.
are all of the menorahs the same size as this
no,
one?
sir. They have thousands of menorahs. I have a catalog at the store that has every kind of menorah there is, from Mickey Mouse to organized baseball. They have, as long as they have the 8 places for the candles and for the head candle. And this also depends on how religious you are. If you're real Orthodox, you're not going to put a Mickey Mouse menorah out there. You're going to have a regular menorah, and probably one that's been handed down through family through generations. I mean, we still have the one that my parents use, and it goes that way.
The blessings, what?
Okay.
I realize that, well, explain what a blessing is.
Well, it'd probably be easier to read it to you than to explain it to you, because I have it here in English, translated.
Okay.
It says here, on the first night of Hanukkah, it says, "Blessed art thou, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by commandments and commanded us to kindle the light of Hanukkah." The other one is, "Blessed art thou, Lord our God, King of the universe, who performed miracles for our fathers in days of old at this season." And those are said every night, the same ones.
Same one.
Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
So there's no variations in the blessings.
In the Orthodox, there's not. Now, some of the other, like Conservative or Reform, they have a little blessing for every night that goes along with this. Like, for instance, here, let's say for the seventh day of the holiday, it says here, "The 7th is the calm light of patience. Nothing can be achieved in haste. The spreading tree and soul of man grow slowly to perfection. Thus sang King David, trust in the Lord, wait patiently for him." And there's one of those for every single night. Now this is done more on the Reform side and the conservative side rather than the Orthodox side. The Orthodox side is mostly done in Hebrew, which I do have that here with me as well. And I can't read it.
And I believe you are of the Orthodox faith.
Right, right. We can't keep a whole lot of Orthodox here in Glasgow because there's nowhere to get the proper foods and different things like that. But we joined the Orthodox because we felt comfortable there. All our family goes there. But we do have family members that are members of the Conservative and some that are members of the Reform. But basically, all of them believe in lighting the menorah.
I think we've been dealing here, Van, with a subject that is sometimes confusing, and that is when we start talking about blessing and talk about blessing God, some people say, how in the world and how can a layman or a human being bless God? They don't understand the nature of a blessing. Would you explain?
Well, I think in the use that probably you would find this similar too, the idea is it's a thanksgiving. In other words, you're thanking God or you're expressing appreciation for what God has done for you. That would be true in Judaism as well as in Christianity. It's not as if you're asking a blessing on God, but it's the idea of expressing praise or expressing thanks to God for what He has done or what we anticipate that we would like to ask Him to do in the prayer. Something along those lines is what you're talking about.
And the bottom line is that it is a form of worshiping God by giving thanks.
Yes, exactly. You would have, I think another thing that would play a part here is that the language that's used is often the language that God uses, you know, in those things that are directed to us in Scripture. And so there'd be sort of a commonness of language there too, and that's probably another reason that that's the way it's expressed.
Suppose you discuss some of the customs that have originated in Christianity insofar as the celebration of Christmas is concerned, other than celebrating Christ's birth by various church activities, but such things as the candy cane. We'll start with the candy cane. I think that's a good one to start with.
Yeah, that was very interesting. The fellow who came up with a candy cane lived in Indiana, my home state, and he wanted to make this and sell it, but he wanted to invest it with a lot of Christian symbolism. And of course, all of the things that go with Christmas do not necessarily have Christian symbolism in them, but a lot of them have a lot and very, very heavy Christian symbolism. But basically, he came up with this piece of pure white hard candy, which was to symbolize the purity of Christ and of His life. He also saw it as symbolizing the virgin birth that's taught in Matthew and in Luke. The red stripe that goes around it was to symbolize the blood of Christ, which of course in the Christian gospel is the most important element. And then the third thing is that he made the J, a candy cane looks like a J, to represent the first letter of Jesus' name. And so you have a lot of these kinds of symbols that are a part of it. Now, some of the things that are a part of the Christmas celebration, like the Yule log, the best that we know about that is that really comes out of these celebrations that Christianity sort of took over from sort of their neighbors when Christmas was first began to be celebrated. And for example, they saw that back then as the popping of the log and the sparks that flew off. That was a prayer for their cattle and so forth to be fertile. So there's a symbol. And Christians have kind of, in a sense, baptized some of those and brought them over into the church like we often do. You know, we'll take something and sort of invest it with meaning. And the tree, of course, is another big thing. Everybody has a Christmas tree. An evergreen was picked because that had certain symbolism with the idea that Christianity teaches or promises eternal life, and that's an evergreen tree, or one that's grows all year round. It isn't a seasonal like some of our trees. The lights on it and so forth represent the stars, you know, that the wise men saw. And you can go on and on and on with this. I mean, it just goes on into the night, because you can find that some Christian has found symbolism in everything, I guess, associated with Christmas somewhere along the line.
What about the candles as far as Christianity is concerned?
Again, I think it's just the idea of the light. Jesus comes as the light of the world would be one symbol that people have saw in that. And of course, you have the stars that guide the wise men, and that's just a way to represent those kind of things. So, like I said, this goes on and on into the night, and like the candy cane, a lot of it has, I mean, there's just meaning all over the place. Somebody will read something into almost all of it.
Berky, so far we've talked about Hanukkah being, in essence, I take it, from a family matter. Is there any celebration of it insofar as the congregation is concerned?
Not that I know of. Now they have had some what they call latke parties at the synagogue for the children and things like that, but other than that, and they say daily prayers every morning, people that go to synagogue. But other than that, I don't see that there's that much in there on this particular holiday. I do know this is the only holiday that is not listed in the Bible. Why, I don't know, but it seemed kind of funny to me, but it has no basis. It says Hanukkah is the only major Jewish holiday that is not listed in the Bible, which leads me to think it's not a real holy holiday. It's just a holiday of miracles, of the miracle of lights.
I can tell you why.
I was going to ask you.
Okay? Because this liberation of the temple with Judas comes in the 2nd century BC, and the teaching of not just the Jewish people but of the Christian faith would be the understanding that the Old Testament closed with the writing of Malachi, or the Hebrew Bible, if you're from that, you know, from the Jewish end of it. But the reason for that is this is after the period of the canonical Old Testament text, which that last book comes somewhere around 400 BC. And of course, this liberation of the temple comes 250 years after that, in about the date I remember off the top of my head is like 146 or something like that. Somewhere around in that time. So it's completely outside of the history of the Old Testament as we have it.
The Old Testament closed not too long after the return of the Hebrews from captivity by the Babylonians.
That's correct.
When they finally came back and restored the temple that time and so forth, and shortly thereafter the Old Testament closes. As far as I know, that's true of both your religion and the Christian religion.
That's correct.
I think so.
That's correct.
So that's a good explanation for that. Getting back to you, Van, how was, in the early days after Christmas was accepted as a celebration for the birth of Christ, how was it first celebrated in the churches by the Christians outside of these symbols?
Okay. Of course, you have to remember that for many, many years the dominant form of Christianity was Catholicism, and of course I would imagine that the way it is celebrated in the Catholic Church today would not be dramatically dissimilar to what went on in those early days. And it was basically like all of their services would be incorporated into a Mass where they would remember the birth of Christ. Now, you kind of have an interesting history about this, because the church in the West, which we are sort of the heirs of, chose December the 25th, and that's when it became the official date. You find that the churches in the East, which would be like the Greek Orthodox Church, they celebrate their holiday on January the 6th. And so that's why you get a sort of a discrepancy between those two streams of Christianity. Now, when you sort of come down a little bit after the period of the Protestant Reformation, it's interesting that the celebration of Christmas kind of went two directions. Those who kind of went with Martin Luther, because Luther proceeded on a principle that whatever was not condemned is authorized. And so he brought over many of the practices and the rituals and the celebrations and so forth that he inherited from the Catholic Church. And again, you'd find in many Lutheran churches and those that stayed very closely with that, they'd probably celebrate it fairly similarly. Now then you had another group, primarily who came from Zwingli, and his principle of operation was anything that is not explicitly authorized we won't do. And so they kind of reacted against some of these things that Catholicism observed, and so you'll find that many of those people actually rejected the celebration of Christianity. And you find in England in the 1600s, when the Puritans got control of the government, they outlawed Christianity, and in fact they had laws that said all stores will be open on December 25th and all churches will be closed. And they had laws for this. Of course, that's kind of, I think, changed, although I found one fellow on the internet who had like a 12-page thing you could download on why he doesn't celebrate Christmas. So you still have churches that don't in any formal way celebrate that. And I would say that in those churches that have been influenced by the Puritans, you'd find that the celebration is a lot less probably dramatic, I guess, and it doesn't have the ritual elements that it would in Catholicism and those churches that follow the liturgical calendar and things like that.
As I understand it, the Pilgrims carried over this from England, this idea we will not celebrate Christmas. And
that is correct.
Everybody worked and so forth in the early days of New England.
That's correct.
It gradually opened up some, but as you say, they're still more conservative than we are.
Well, you have to remember, the Pilgrims are Puritans.
Yeah.
So that's where they got that from. There was very much this reaction against certain of the liturgical elements of the Catholic tradition. And so they wanted to not observe those things. And you find a lot of that.
Explain what you mean by liturgical elements.
Okay. The Catholic Church follows what you call a liturgical calendar. And it actually starts with this time of year. And it, you know, they have these various celebrations. Of course, the two main ones that we know of would be Christmas and Easter, which celebrates the resurrection or is focused around that. But they have other celebrations, or they have other observances through that. And you will find that, as I said, Catholicism, and there are other churches, Lutherans, some Presbyterians, Episcopalian churches, they follow a liturgical calendar. And so all these observances, their whole year is kind of structured around that. That's why, for example, if you go by the Methodist Church down there on South Green at certain times of year, they'll have things out in front of their church because they're following the liturgical calendar. For example, around Easter, they'll have a cross out there with a purple sash around it because that's part of their worship observance. And their whole worship service is sort of structured around that. Now, those churches that have sort of followed in the Puritan tradition do not follow a liturgical calendar, and their observance of some of these other things would, I guess, be somewhat voluntary. Of course, most of them now do some things, certainly about Christmas and about Easter, but you'd find some of them that don't do any. For example, many of the Churches of Christ, the group that I'm a part of, don't celebrate Christmas in really any sense. I mean, they wouldn't do anything about it, and they would even be offended, or, you know, you would certainly cause some eyebrows to go up if you were to like sing Christmas carols around this time of year. And there's lots of other churches that do the same thing.
But you're not saying that all churches of Christ
No.
are that way.
But we would be like a lot of churches where what any given church would do, it would just sort of be up to them. It would be sort of an individual congregational decision. That's, it would vary, in other words.
As I understand, that's your church's tradition. I mean, where you are now, the
Right.
church that you're the pastor of.
Right, that's correct.
That was my understanding.
Right, that's correct.
Do you have any idea, Berky, when the idea of exchanging the gifts that you talk about when you celebrate Hanukkah, was that in the beginning, the very beginning, or is that something that came later? Or
I think it came later. I really do. I don't think they exchanged any gifts back in the olden days. It's never been mentioned by my rabbi at all. And I know one funny thing is, to me, of course, they celebrate Christmas the 25th of December. Hanukkah is always celebrated the 25th of Kislev, same day. But it doesn't land at the same time every year. It goes by the Jewish calendar, which is in the year 5750-something right now, I believe, or 5740-something, which dates back, way further back than that. But in the readings that I've read, I've never seen that where they just exchange gifts or anything.
well, I had never heard or never seen this statement or fact that you've just stated, that Hanukkah is on the same date in the Jewish calendar as Christmas is on the Christian calendar. I never heard that.
Well, it's
Were you aware of that?
Yeah, I read it in some of the material that I got, yeah.
It's the same day, but
Yeah,
sometimes not the same month. And I don't know why that would be any different.
I wonder why, if there is some connection insofar as the 25 is concerned.
I don't know.
I don't know.
I wouldn't have any
I
idea
wouldn't
on
have
that
any
at all.
idea either, but
But I know
it's sort of unique.
that Christmas is on the 25th every year in our calendar, the regular calendar that everybody uses. But yet on our calendar, and I don't think it runs on the 30-day calendar. It must be longer days, because sometimes Hanukkah lands in the middle of November, sometimes it lands the 1st of December, sometimes the middle of December, sometimes the end. But it never goes past December.
Now, it's obvious that many of your faith have accepted and abide by and perform some of the customs of Christmas.
True.
Does that cause any problems among the different branches of?
It would depend on how religious they were. In other words, there's 3 sections of Judaism. There's the Reform, which is the least religious, then the Conservative, which is in between, and then the Orthodox. Now, the Orthodox have very little leeway on their celebration of this holiday, whereas the Conservative and the Reform have a lot of leeway. They do not wear skull caps. Some of them don't use prayer shawls. But as far as causing a rift in families, it could do that. I mean, there's been a lot of intermarriage.
Yeah.
And I can see where that would antagonize a person that's Orthodox, and let's say their child marries Reform. It'd be almost like somebody from the Church of Christ maybe marrying somebody that's Catholic. There would be some rift there. Maybe not as much as what we would have, but there would be some rift.
This is departing somewhat from the original subject here, but what about intermarriage between people of your religion and Christianity? Does that cause a rift?
Yes, it does. We're having one right now in our family. My son is getting married in March, and he is marrying someone of the Methodist faith. But she is studying Judaism. I don't say she will convert, because we're not trying to convert her. But we want her to learn, like this holiday here and the rest of them. And the riff really is not with the kids, it's with the parents, depending on how they were brought up. You know, some were brought up Reformed, some were brought up conservative, some were brought up Orthodox. The Orthodox, of course, is much more religious than the other two sects. My rabbi has very little leeway. He goes strictly by the book, and that's the way it is.
Now, what's the book?
Well, the Torah.
Okay.
And the others two sections have the Torah, but they don't interpret it the same way. And it's just a matter of interpretation of how you interpret the Torah. And he interprets it strictly by the letter of the law, where the others have a little leeway. In other words, if they want to go to synagogue and not put on a prayer shawl or a yarmulke, cover your head when you're in the synagogue, they don't do it. But now, if you go in an Orthodox synagogue, and let's say you're just visiting, as soon as you walked in the door, someone in there would hand you a skull cap and maybe offer you a prayer shawl, because everyone that's in there wears it as soon as they pass the age of 13, which is when they're bar mitzvah. So you're supposed to become a man and put away your childish thoughts. But some synagogues take a little of both. We went to a bar mitzvah last year for a cousin of mine where the parents of the bride were Orthodox, but the parents of the not the bride, but the mother, and the parents of the boy's father were Reformed. So they integrated some of both ceremonies into the ceremony. They did use a prayer shawl, and they did use a yarmulke, but the rabbi didn't.
Now, what does the prayer shawl represent? Why the prayer shawl?
I don't know. To be honest with you, I really don't know. I think I was taught it a long time ago, but I just don't remember. But on the prayer shawl, and I don't translate Hebrew, is a blessing that you say every time you put it on and every time you take it off. And you kiss each end of it. But as far, I know what the prayer says, but why they wear it, I don't know. I just know it's been handed down for years and years and years.
Now, in the Orthodox faith, is that used in all religious customs?
Yes, yes. The weddings, bar mitzvahs, or for the high holy days, if you're called up to the Torah to read. If you don't have a prayer shawl, the synagogue will provide you with one. But you can't, you're not supposed to go up to the Torah to read from it without a prayer shawl on.
Getting back to Christmas, I started to ask, but I guess it was sort of came with it. I started to ask when the levity part of it started. But since it was following somewhat a Roman holiday, and the levity was always there, I guess, or at least some levity.
Yeah, that is correct. In fact, one of the reasons that the Puritans wanted to say we're not going to do this anymore was because they were concerned about some of the things that went on sort of in connection with it. In fact, if you read the material, they'll tell you that the one sort of really obvious holdover of this sort of pagan background is the mistletoe thing, where you get to go and steal a kiss from somebody. That's kind of the one obvious holdover from that. But a lot of the things that we're very familiar with about Christmas, and I guess you would think of these as some of the secular issues, you know, all the buying and giving of gifts and so forth. a lot of that really goes back to very recent history. Things like Christmas cards go back to the 1700s. Even the Christmas tree as a pretty settled symbol pretty much across the board in all countries, that goes back to just the 17 or 1800s. This sort of thing about Santa Claus, a lot of that as we observe it in our country today goes back to even the middle 1800s. So a lot of that's just kind of evolved over time. And one of the sources that I read had kind of an interesting point that a fellow back in the middle 1800s, I think it was 1843, drew this picture that became the one. And so all Santa Clauses after that sort of look like this character that he drew. And it wasn't very long after that that people found out if this picture has this power or influence, think what would happen if we had one show up in person. And so in a little later than that, a little later, 1800s, this idea of having him show up at the store so he could help you sell all this merchandise that you got in became something that people did. Well, see, those are very, very recent origin and that sort of thing. Another thing that was mentioned as real significant in the emergence of all of that was Dickens' A Christmas Carol. That from that point on, Christmas became a lot more focused on family and giving gifts as a way of expressing friendship or family relationships. And a lot of the levity, I guess the really extreme levity, there are practices that were associated with this that maybe aren't too Christian, those began to die away at that point.
How many churches, I don't know about Catholic, or I do know about some Protestants, but how many of them during the Christmas season usually have some event where Santa Claus comes to the church for the children? Is that widespread, or?
I would assume it is. Again, I really don't know a lot about that. I would think that a lot of churches would not do that because they would think of it as infringing on the sacred or the religious observance of that. But I'm sure there are a lot that do as well. You know, I really couldn't give you any kind of a breakdown of that. I don't know the answer to that.
What about Santa Claus in the Jewish religion?
Well, I can only give you my experiences. And of course, my kids grew up in Glasgow. And we had a Santa Claus that came to the house. We didn't celebrate Christmas, but it was a fun time for the children. And we would have, usually, one of the Catholic fathers would come over. They'd be dressed up. And of course, my kids were young back then. And to them, Santa Claus was a fun holiday. I mean, it didn't have any connotations of if Christ was born that day or anything like that. It was just a matter of exchanging gifts, seeing your friends, and things like that. It had nothing to do really much with religion at all. And I think they kind of think of this almost the same way. This is one of only a very few Jewish holidays that are fun holidays. Most of them are serious holidays. But this is one, and all kids enjoy it. My wife went to school and put on a program with these at the South Green Street Elementary School and fixed them a traditional dish of Hanukkah, which is potato pancakes and applesauce for the whole school. And most of the children came. Only one child did not, because it was against their religious beliefs, which we understand, and that's not a problem with us at all, because everyone does not believe the same thing. But the main thing is that they all get along together well. And they did, and they enjoyed it. But my kids have always enjoyed Christmas. They enjoy Hanukkah too. They have the best of both worlds.
Insofar as Christianity is concerned now, Van, are we seeing more people attending church and so forth and abiding by the Christmas spirit or less?
Well, the statistics that I see suggest that church attendance has not changed in any dramatic sense in quite a while. There's sort of I think an impression maybe that church attendance is on the rise because we hear a lot in our culture about these sort of super large churches. You know, you have this church, this Christian church in Louisville that has several thousand members, or you hear of these kind of churches, you know, usually they're associated with well-known preachers or maybe somebody you see on the television or so forth. All the statistics that I see suggest that church attendance is holding fairly level. What you have in a lot of these churches is people who just simply leave a smaller church and go to a bigger church because they can offer more services or they can do more things. You know, it's just like Walmart, because they're nationwide, can do a whole lot more than a little local department store could do. But
I didn't phrase my question very well. On Easter, you have more people come to church than any other time of the year.
Yeah.
Now, is there any increase generally, insofar as you know, in attendance at church or churches, Catholic and Protestant, during Christmas?
Oh yeah, I'm sure there is. I'm sure Christmas is just like Easter. You have a whole bunch of people. In fact, I'll tell you the old preacher joke. The old preacher joke is that you stand at the back door on Easter and say, "Hey, Brother Smith, it's amazing how much weight a person can lose between Christmas and Easter." Because you know you haven't seen him in between those two. So,
I think that's kind of true in our religion too.
Yeah, you have people who show up sort of at the high holy days, and you may not see them anymore. No, I know in our church, which again, as I said, is not a liturgically oriented church, you'll notice a big increase on Christmas and Easter, and I'm sure that's true of our religious neighbors who may observe Christmas and Easter in a far more formal way than we do. And that's been true everywhere I've ever been. You always have a bunch more people show up.
We have that happening between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Some of those people you don't see but just those 2 days. And the rest of the day they're not there. And then you have a religious bunch that shows up most every week. And it's usually the same people.
Now, why? I direct the question to both. Why is it true in your religion, and why is it true in Christianity?
In my religion, and I'm going to use my father as an example, of course he worked all his life, and when he retired, he decided he wanted to keep more religion. He wanted more religion in his life. He would not move over a mile away from the synagogue, because if you walk over a mile to the synagogue or to church, that's work. That's not enjoyment. So he always had a house within a mile of the synagogue. But he would go every morning and every evening. Now when he was working, he couldn't do that. And he got to be much more religious as he got older. The more time he had away from his work, the more time he spent at the synagogue for praying, for different things that he went there for to do. But I think that's just in the individual. In other words, you're going to find some people in my religion that are not very religious, and you're going to find some that are very, very religious. And I think you'll find that true in Christianity as well. You're going to find some people that are very, very religious. They're there every Sunday for church, and not because they're supposed to be there, because they feel it in their heart they want to be there. And that's what my dad always told me. Now, I don't know what his answer would be to that, but that's what ours was.
Well, I think that's some of the same kinds of things. I mean, one reason you always have this swell on these days is because a lot of times the kids come home who don't go to church normally, but when they're home they will come with their parents. And I think another thing that plays a role is that you have people who, you know, for whatever reason are not as committed or don't feel the need to go on a regular basis at other times, but they do try to come those times. And who knows, maybe that will be a time that someone will get serious, you know. Maybe it will cause them to rethink what they're doing with their priorities or their times. I mean, I've found in my experience, it's amazing sometimes to me what causes a person to come and say, you know, I haven't been very serious about being a Christian, but I'm going to start now. Maybe they've had a death in the family. Maybe they've had some scare or something, or they've just had some experience and they decide, hey, it's time for me to get serious about this. It could just be they've gotten a little older. But I think the reason you have a lot more people on these days is some of it is this family connection. I think another thing is people sometimes maybe know they need to be more serious, they need to be involved in church, but this is a day that motivates them to get started, and maybe it'll be the sort of the opening of a new trend in their life.
And I think another reason is that they want to set an example for their children. Children are very impressionable. If you take somebody that is used to going with his parents every Sunday to church, when he grows up and he goes out and gets married, he's going to take his family to church because that's the way he's been brought up and that's the way he's been taught. Same way in our religion. I mean, every Saturday when I was growing up, we went to synagogue. Now, whenever we have a chance to go, I always tell my children, go. They go anyway.
Unfortunately, Berky, my observation is that is less true than it was in my generation and probably in your generation. I know people, parents now, that their parents took them to Sunday school and they went to church and Sunday school every Sunday. These parents are either not taking their children to Sunday school or dropping them off, and they're not going themselves. Then they may come and pick them up and go to church, or they may just pick them up and go home. And I think the van will verify what I'm saying.
Yeah, in fact, it's been demonstrated in our society. You had this large group that in the 60s and the 70s basically dropped out of church, but we also find that lots of them now are coming back. You know, they're so, you know, that probably is good.
I know that's happened in our synagogues. There's been 3 in Nashville forever. At least I've been there since 1950. And all of a sudden now, we have a 4th. So I think those kids, somewhere along the line, have picked up religion or found it in their heart to go. Otherwise, they wouldn't put up anymore.
Well, I agree that it's coming back, and thank God it is. It's definitely needed, because I think a lot of your problems today with teenagers and young people are the direct result of the fact that they weren't disciplined and weren't taken to church and Sunday school and so forth when they were small. And you've got to start, in my judgment, with them when they're small. If you wait, it's too late.
See, that's what we do.
Some churches have strict observance of Advent these days. When did that start?
That goes back quite a ways. Advent is basically the name for, there's a celebration, again, which our liturgically oriented friends observe, where it's an entire month. And it sort of kicks off with, they'll have certain things that they do, and basically that it's a leading up to this celebration. It's kind of interesting in a way, Uhel, that the most well-known celebration of Christianity, of course, is Christmas. I mean, it's not only influenced churches, but our secular society. I mean, even Walmart closes down, you know, on Christmas. The one day of the year you can't go out there. But it's interesting that in terms of the New Testament and sort of the gospel message, the important or the decisive element in the life of Jesus isn't his birth, it's his death, burial, and resurrection. That's what makes the whole thing go. But you're right that Advent is just this whole complex of observance that leads up to Christmas, and then you even have what's called, in some churches, the Epiphany, which is 12 days after Christmas. And that's to celebrate the coming of the Magi, or the wise men that are talked about in the Gospel of Matthew. And that's all tied up together. And that's sort of where all that comes from.
And some Protestant churches carry it out very faithfully.
Right.
And yet some of the same denomination ignore it.
Yeah. Well, again, it basically comes down to whether it's a liturgically oriented church or a non-liturgically oriented church. Those that are very liturgically oriented observe the whole thing. Those that aren't kind of either don't do anything, or they pick and choose the parts that they want to emphasize.
I think a lot depends on the minister.
Probably.
Of a typical church.
Yep.
I think he has a lot to do with it. But Berky, there's one thing out there that we haven't talked about. What is that?
Which is that? This is a dreidel also, and it's a music box, and it plays a song called Dreidel, 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 which we learned when I was in Hebrew school. You can see the letters better on this one here. They're bigger. And actually it's the same as this, except this is just a keepsake for home. This you can use to play the actual game that they play with the dreidel. Now these come almost in any form, fashion you can name. Made out of glass, sterling silver, or anything. There's no set regulations on what to make out of it, or what style to make out of it. And then you do have a sect of the Jewish religion, the Hasidim, that don't believe at all in it. There's supposed to be no frivolity at all in the synagogue. So they don't practice this at all. But that's all this is just a bigger version of this. See? And it does have all the letters that go with it, and the understanding. And it's basically just as a keepsake for the family. In other words, like this right here. When we go, we will probably pass it down to one of our children, just like my parents have passed theirs down to us. Theirs is so old we don't even use it anymore. We just keep it under glass and save it as a memento of what they went through. See, because through most of their life, there was not a menorah. Through the war, and back in those days, and even in early Russia, when Stalin took over, there was no religion. There was, and I mean, it was a very religious country at one time, but there was no religion practiced at all. And now, I know at our synagogue, we've brought over 60 Jewish families that are from Russia, and they can't even read the books because they have not been taught. They were not allowed to practice it, and now they are, so we had to buy them all Russian prayer books so they could read the prayer books. And for a long time during World War II, I know you couldn't have found a menorah in Europe. They should look really hard. And now it's celebrated very widely, almost everywhere. I was in Japan and they were celebrating it there. Of course, it was a Jewish synagogue there, but they had a Japanese rabbi, and he was doing Hanukkah lights and all the other things. So it has come back, especially after World War II. Before then, didn't.
Speaking of Japan, I read very recently where they're beginning to accept and practice the levity customs, I have called them, of Christianity. Not, of course, you do have some Christians in Japan, but I'm talking about the population of as a whole is picking up the idea of Christmas trees and exchanges of gifts and so forth.
I think that's been brought over there by the Catholic Fathers.
And I don't know how it got there, but maybe MacArthur planted it.
That's who was there when I was there. They had a Catholic father in almost every big city.
Well, I wouldn't call MacArthur a Catholic father.
No.
He may have planted it.
This was an actual Catholic priest that was stationed over there.
Gentlemen, our time is up. I certainly appreciate each one of you being here, and each one of you have contributed to a very interesting discussion, and I think it's beneficial for the citizens of Glasgow. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking us.
Thanks for asking us.